I am here with John Ramdeen chatting about all of today's news, and I think it's going to be very focused on UFC 205, which is happening November the 12th at Madison Square Garden. They did get the main event they wanted with Eddie Alvarez and Conor McGregor, and just looking at this from a fight card from top to bottom, John, would you agree this is the deepest card the UFC has ever put together, pending any injuries and who makes it to New York? But on paper, this is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, this is what the casual fans wanted. This is what even the hardcore fans, I guess they were not satisfied enough with some of the big names being on the card. You have Frankie Edgar on the card.
You're questioning why Alvarez and McGregor's on this card.
No, not that why it's on the card. I understand. People need a marquee name, and I guess Chris Weidman and Donald Cerrone and Frankie Edgar and all the other great fighters that were on this card, they weren't good enough. You needed a Conor McGregor or you needed a Ronda Rousey because this show is so huge because it's in New York for the first time. That's just the way it works.
But you're getting all those fights you mentioned.
No, I understand. So then
you're getting more.
I get it. But my point is, let's just say Conor and Eddie wasn't on this show. UFC 205 happens in Madison Square Garden. The crowd is going to go bananas because Frankie's on the show. He's from New Jersey. Chris Weidman's on the show. They're going to go nuts as well. On top of that, it's going to be a thrilling night of fights. What are you going to get? You're going to get athletes that are going to throw down and smash each other. And when you leave Madison Square Garden, or if you leave when you finish watching on pay-per-view, you're going to get a great night of fights. I just didn't think it necessarily needed Conor McGregor and Eddie Alvarez. I guess that's just what the fans need.
Well, you have to also understand it from the UFC's side. I think you take away that lightweight title fight. What do you figure this is doing? 350,000 buys with Thompson and Woodley and
sure, but that's just the
strawweights?
That's just the reality.
This is now a $1 million buy show.
Sure,
and that's minimum. That's a conservative estimate.
I get it, but that's the reality. It's only because Conor McGregor is in this pay-per-view that it's going to do those type of numbers. If you remove Conor from the roster, you don't have Ronda. How many fighters on the UFC's roster right now can do 500,000 or 700,000 plus pay-per-view buys?
No, it's a finite number, which is why it's very big when one of them is fighting on top of a card. I think that this truly does make this a massive blockbuster show. I think this is a more deeper card than UFC 200
right,
was.
But the reality is, then scrap everybody else. You don't need a single other fighter on this card. All you need is Conor McGregor and Eddie Alvarez and a bunch of jobbers underneath, and the card will sell itself. It'll do 1 million pay-per-view buys. Do you disagree?
On its own, it would still do very well with that
Exactly,
fight.
And that's my point, is the fact that the fans, they need something other than the combat itself. They need some sort of storyline, and they need some sort of hyped interest instead of getting terrific mixed martial arts.
So John Ramdeen's UFC 205 would be headlined by who?
Again, you had Tyron Woodley and Stephen Wonderboy Thompson. If you're a fan of fighting, they're going to deliver. Joanna Jacek, she beats the shit out of her opponents every time she's inside of the cage. Frankie Edgar delivers. Jeremy Stevens delivers. The countless other fighters on this card deliver every time they're in action.
I'm trying to get into your head here. Is your anger at the fact that those two alone, that Woodley and Stephen Thompson, doesn't appeal to more people?
Yeah, I guess that's
that
it.
more people didn't buy UFC 201 to see Woodley beat Robbie Lawler. Yeah. Is it just looking at the fan base? Because there's no way you can fault the UFC for just making a bigger card that you have no doubt is going to be bigger than it was on Sunday.
I'm just confused at what people are looking for in a main event.
Big names, big fighters, stories.
So that's what I mean. So Tyron Woodley and Stephen Thompson isn't that the fight? Didn't people just see what Stephen Thompson did to Rory McDonald? Didn't people see Tyron Woodley take out Robbie Lawler? I'm confused. If they're looking for good fight action, this card already had it, but people had to bitch and bitch and bitch. You had Donald Cerrone on the card, so if you're looking for star power, that still wasn't enough. I'm just curious to know what's next after 205. What happens if Conor isn't competing for a number of months? What other stars do you have if you don't have Ronda, you don't have George, you don't have Brock?
Great fighters, though, and great fights on paper don't always translate to the most mass appeal. I can't wait to watch this bantamweight fight on Saturday night. I think John Lineker and John Dodson is an awesome fight. But I'm aware of the fact that that could not headline a pay-per-view and that a lot less people are going to be watching that, probably than even last weekend when over 1 million people tuned in to watch Cyborg fight a fighter they had probably never seen before in Lena Landsberg.
Yeah, no, I get it. And I just feel that the UFC has dropped the ball for years and years not showcasing Cyborg, and the numbers prove it. They have a commodity, and they just they didn't take advantage of Cyborg the way they should have. They could utilize this girl to be one of the next stars, especially if Ronda decides not to come back.
Now, on Monday, it was also confirmed Chris Weidman and Yoel Romero is on this card after there was definitely some thought that maybe that fight wouldn't get done. It seemed like it was a very last-minute deal with Chris Weidman to get him signed, sealed, and hopefully delivered on November the 12th. And you go down this card, John. Frankie Edgar and Jeremy Stevens, which doesn't even look like that will crack the pay-per-view. I mean, the depth on this card. You have Miesha Tate fighting on this show. You have Tim Kennedy and Rashad Evans. You can go all the way down. Liz Carmouche could end up in the opener on Fight Pass that night.
This is the girl that challenged Ronda Rousey for the UFC women's.
In a headlining position on pay-per-view in 2013.
And that is kind of my point, is that people were so upset that they didn't have a marquee fight, despite the fact that they had all these tremendous athletes and competitors from fight 1 all the way to fight 11, or fight now it's how 13. 13 fights. So from fight 1 all the way to 12, they needed this extra marquee fight. And I guess people weren't even going to be satisfied if it was Khabib and Eddie Alvarez. I don't know. I
will say, as someone that I believe is going to enjoy some points on the back end of this, I'm sure Tyron Woodley is a very happy individual that Conor McGregor is on this card as opposed to not. As well, it came out that Jose Aldo wants out of his UFC contract. He believes that he has been lied to, and he has no faith that Conor McGregor will be stripped of his title after this fight, and is questioning if he will get this fight with Conor McGregor. Does Jose Aldo have grounds to be upset, do you feel? And I don't think it's a realistic possibility they're going to let this guy out of his contract, but this frustration amongst Jose Aldo and the UFC is something that is built for years.
Yeah, and yes, I can understand why he would be frustrated. Hey, this fight, he deserves this fight. And we know that it doesn't matter what a fighter deserves, because we've seen it before. Right now, there's a lot of people bitching about Dan Henderson getting this title shot that he doesn't deserve, when Chris Weidman and Luke Rockhold and Yoel Romero and Jacare, they're all ahead of Dan Henderson in the rankings. But the fact is that Jose Aldo has done enough throughout his career. He's faced the best fighters in the world. He's proven to be one of the pound-for-pound best. Every single year he's been a part of the UFC, and he delivers. And, you know, for him to go out and lose that fight to Conor McGregor, I think you have a huge fight. Yes, of course, Conor wants to go up to 155 pounds, but if Jose Aldo was told that after the Nate Diaz fight that Conor would be forced to go back down to 145 pounds and face off with Jose Aldo for the undisputed championship, now that fight doesn't happen. So that means Jose Aldo doesn't get another big money fight. And you say, yeah, I'll fight Max Holloway or I'll fight somebody else. But this is what the UFC told me. And the one thing I do find a little strange is that Jose Aldo is saying that I want to be released from the UFC so I can retire. Well, you can just retire. You don't have to be released. You can still be under contract. George St. Pierre's under contract. If he decides to walk away from the sport, he can walk away from the sport. Nobody's forcing him to fight those other fights on his contract. What Jose Aldo is looking for is for the UFC to release him so he can go to another suitor like Rory McDonald or Ben Henderson by going to Bellator, because everybody's seeing right now that the #2 organization is offering some big dollars.
Now, another name in all of this was Khabib Nurmagomedov, who some people felt was owed this lightweight title fight. Instead, he's going to be fighting Michael Johnson on this show.
On this card.
I think this is a great position for Nurmagomedov. You are going to be on the same card as the lightweight title fight. It's a great showcase for Nurmagomedov to go out there, and if he looks really great against someone like Michael Johnson, who's coming off his own great win against Dustin Poirier, I think that pushes people in the direction of wanting to see that fight. And Nurmagomedov, I know that some people are kind of upset at the fact he didn't get this title fight. I think this is someone that, as well, he's had one fight since his return after that RDA win in 2014. I think this is a fine fight to make for him at 155. He's on this card, and I think it does a lot for him to be on this card.
I agree, and it's going to be on pay-per-view, right? The Michael Johnson-Khabib fight, that's on pay-per-view, because it only makes sense. Because if you're trying to create a #1 contender for the champion, whether it be Eddie Alvarez or Conor McGregor, people need to see who that is. Because right now, the landscape is so diluted, especially at 155 pounds, with title challengers, worthy title challengers. You know, I said it before that I feel that a guy like Francisco Trinaldo deserves the title shot over Khabib because of how many fights he's won. It's like Khabib's, it was Daryl Horcher, he had that win over. It's his first fight in the last number of years.
Since 2014.
Since 2014, where Trinaldo, 7 fights in a row, named opponents, so you can see how he deserves it. But it's not about deserving. It's about what's going to sell pay-per-views, and you have this Russian that wears this crazy hat opposed to the millionth Brazilian that fights in the UFC. So you can understand how the UFC would pick Khabib over a guy like Trinaldo.
Do you expect UFC 205 to come anywhere close to the McGregor-Diaz rematch number?
Yeah, of course, it's Conor McGregor, and then you add to that a guy like Donald Cerrone and Misha Tate and the former champions Weidman and Frankie Edgar. It's going to do a lot of numbers.
Yes, we will be discussing UFC 205 in detail over the next 2 months. We will be coming back with you with a preview show Saturday night, 8 Eastern, as we look ahead to Saturday's fight card from Portland, Oregon, headlined by John Lineker and John Dodson. You can also catch the prelims from Portland live here on Fight Network.